First I want to introduce Tim Elam, VE6SH, who is president of the IARU, sitting back here in the back. And Tim leads us in all of our activities, and it's good to have him here with us. He was a key part of our WRC 23 effort. Well, I can't see that change on my screen here, so I'm going to step back a little bit here. The first I want to mention, I've got about 17 slides here I want to go through before I get to the outcome of WRC 23, because I want to make sure we're all on the same page as to how radio spectrum is allocated. And there's a lot of people who get confused about this and believe that the FCC allocates spectrum, and that is not correct. They regulate the radio bands, the radio regulations here in the United States, but they do not allocate spectrum. There's one minor exception. If it's allowed in the radio regulations where countries have the options to do some things, they can do that. Recently, when we had a reallocation of the 3.4 gigahertz band that amateurs use is one example, but they do not allocate spectrum. The International Telecommunications Union does that. And they have the responsibility to update and amend the international radio regulations. And a very important key to this that I like to always point out is for you to understand, the International Telecommunications Union has the authority to take the radio spectrum like a deck of cards, shuffle it up, and deal it out as they see fit. And that can be very harmful to amateur radio if we don't have people and positions in place to try to defend the spectrum that we have. The Secretary General of the International Telecommunications Union is Doreen Bogdan-Martin. She happens to have an amateur radio license. She's not the first Secretary General of the ITU to have a license. One of the previous Secretary Generals, Hamadan Touri, was licensed, but she happens to be the first female director of the International Telecommunications Union. The ITU is divided into three sectors. They have the development sector, which is mainly focused on developing communications protocols and within countries, for example, in some parts of Africa where there's not a lot of communications infrastructure. These are some of the things that they deal with. There is the Radio Communications Bureau, and that's the one that we deal predominantly in to work with amateur radio, and that's where the amateur radio service is positioned. And then there's the standardization sector. When you start thinking about decisions from a World Radio Conference, these World Radio Communication Conferences are held every 4 years. The next one will be in 2027. And the agenda for what will be discussed and decided in 2027 was established at this past WRC 23. Business is conducted by consensus of the member states of the ITU. So there's 193 member states or countries, if you will, that belong to the International Telecommunications Union, and they are the ones who have the votes and make up the decisions as to what takes place. The ITUR is divided into subgroups, if you will, and they're called working parties. And they all have different numbers and letters that designate their area of responsibility. Our primary focus is Working Party 5A. And Working Party 5A has to deal with the land mobile service as well as the amateur and the amateur satellite service. And I always like to point this out. It's very, very important to understand that the reason amateur radio gets so much visibility internationally and within the International Telecommunications Union is because it is a licensed radio service, and it's defined in the international regulations as such. So how in the world does amateur radio get represented within the ITU? And that's the job of the International Amateur Radio Union. The International Amateur Radio Union is a global society, membership organization, if you will, that has member societies as their members. In other words, the National Association of Amateur Radio in the United States is ARRL. ARRL is a member. The Radio Society of Great Britain is. There are no individual members of the International Amateur Radio Union. It's all societies, and you support the International Amateur Radio Union by being a member of your national radio society. IARU is divided into 3 regions. Region 1, which is Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Region 2, North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean. And then Region 3 is Asia and the Pacific. And this is really based on how the ITU used to define regions around the world. ARRL happens to serve as the international secretariat for IARU. They get to appoint the secretary, which is my job, but then the member societies around the world elect the president and the vice president. The IARU's decisions are made by an administrative council. That's really the IARU board, and it's made up of the president, vice president, secretary, and then 2 representatives from each of the regions. So in the past, years ago, spectrum was allocated principally, with the ITU and the national regulators. The decisions that were reached at the ITU came from conferences through negotiation, compromise, and then ultimately voting. To win spectrum, or to get spectrum allocated for you, a strong majority of the member states needed to vote in favor of it, obviously. And during that time, amateur radio made a lot of significant gains. Everyone, I think, is familiar with the new HF bands that were allocated for the amateur radio service in 1979. If you're not familiar with that process, you should be, because after 45 years, we still refer to them as WRC bands and not amateur radio bands. Pet peeve of mine. So, and then you have primary allocations and secondary allocations. So if you are allocated spectrum and you're not the primary user, you're a secondary user, you have to protect the primary user. You can't cause interference to whoever is the primary allocated user. But things are a lot different today, and this is what complicates the process and makes it really tough. The ITU today works by consensus. So out of those 193 member states, those countries, one country, if they want to be stubborn, can block a decision. And that's difficult. I don't know how many people we have in this room. It's not 193, but I'll bet if someone stood up and had a proposal to change something, probably one of you would disagree. So think about all of the geopolitical people you have to deal with around the world, and to try to get something done, it's really difficult. And here's a really key part today. The administrations in the country, even the FCC, and that's what drove the 3.4 gig reallocation, they see it as spectrum as a revenue source. And that can create billions of dollars for a government in a country. There's an emerging role now that we see develop with regional telecom organizations, and I've got a slide to talk about those. There are 6 that deal with areas around geographical areas of the world. So all of the government administrations within those areas really start working up through those regional telecom organizations. So it's a much harder environment, and we really hear a lot today about spectrum sharing. That's really a push that ITU is telling everyone, that you need to be able to share spectrum, because there just isn't anymore. So here are these regional telecom organizations. You have APT, which takes care of Asia Pacific, ASMG, the Arab states, ATU Africa, CEPT, CEPT in Europe. Y'all are probably familiar and heard of them. CETEL here in the Americas, and then the RCC, which is just a group of some of the independent states of the former Soviet Union. So Achieving agreement is really started by national administrations developing proposals or draft positions that they want to see changed in the radio regulations. Those usually go up through the regional telecom organizations and then into these working parties that I mentioned, and then up to the World Radio Communications Conference. So at WRC 23, the issue that you heard a lot about and was our primary focus on 23 centimeters actually was an agenda item from WRC 19 in 2019. The French government, which is a huge sponsor of the Galileo navigational system, Galileo had some interference from amateur radio. Now, it wasn't from any weak signal VHF work. It was not from EME work. It was from an ATV repeater that was running 24 hours a day with a test pattern or whatever. And some of the ground locations for the Galileo system were being interfered with. This got resolved after a long time, but that was a real issue. The Galileo folks wanted things resolved quicker when they had interference issues. So they had enough clout at WRC 19, they got this on the agenda. And it basically was to, that they acknowledged some amateur emissions are causing interference. They're not getting solved quickly. We need something to resolve those more quickly. But they did say they did not want to remove the amateur service from the 23 centimeter band. We are secondary there, so we had to protect this service. Now, I'll give you a little personal opinion here. They didn't want to remove the amateur radio service, but they would have been pretty darn happy if they could have achieved that, okay? You know, we print one thing, but that's really not our objective. So, the global positioning navigational satellite system worldwide consists of 6 systems. In the United States, we have the GPS system. In Russia, they have GLONASS. India has a regional navigational system. China has their own. And then the European Union has Galileo. It is comforting, it should be comforting to us as hams here in the United States that the United States government didn't really jump on this to try to push any kind of restrictions on amateur radio. Why? The GPS system was not being interfered with. This was strictly a European problem. But since radio signals don't have any boundaries, it became an international issue being pushed by the Galileo folks and the French government. So an interesting part here, this is the IARU team that was at WRC 23 that was held in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates this year. And a key thing I want to point out here is with the exception of Tim, Elam, myself, and Barry Lewis, who really led the workforce. This is Barry over here. All of those folks in that photo are radio amateurs. And they are actively, very active participants to defend the amateur radio service. But one of the problems that we struggle with in getting our point across at the ITU, we're not a voting member. We are a sector member of the ITU, but we don't have a vote. And in a lot of these working party meetings and at WRC, we can't even speak for or against a particular issue. Here's the exception. Every one of those people other than Tim, myself, and Barry were able to become members of their national delegation. And John Seiberling, right over here, works for ARL on the far right. John is a member of the United States delegation. As a member of a national delegation, You can stand up in all of these meetings and speak. Now, each delegation only has one vote, so to speak, but this allows us to be in these working parties, in these meetings at the WRC, and have people that can actually stand up and speak in support of amateur radio. That's a key point. So, the 23 centimeter issue, it took 4 years to reach a resolution on this. It began after WRC 19, when it was placed on the agenda, and all of these working party meetings, other meetings leading up to and during WRC 23 required a lot of work. I'm going to back up if I can. I want to highlight someone else here. I mentioned Barry Lewis, who was really our really key figure that led the work for getting this resolution. There's also a person here, second from the right. The white-haired gentleman in the front row is Dale Hughes, VK1, I'm going blank. What's this called him? Yeah, VK1 DSH. He's an Australian. Dale was able to be appointed as the chair of the sub-working group that dealt specifically with this issue. Now, even though he's a ham, he has to remain partial, and he needs to try to work through a very sticky situation. Dale's personality and the way he handles the meetings was so beneficial to the amateur radio service. If it hadn't been for his work and guidance, we would have never reached a resolution. So here is what was finally agreed at WRC about the 23 centimeter band. Basically, we have a footnote that will appear in the radio regulations, and you can read it for yourself, but basically, we still get to operate in the band. Right now, we don't have any restrictions. And if interference occurs, there's direction here for an administration to resolve it quickly. So basically, this was a win for us. Even though it's a compromise, there may still be some areas of the world, particularly in Europe maybe, where we see limitations placed on 23 centimeter operations. Right now, there aren't any. Those are still being debated within these regional telecoms. And here in the United States, Jay, fire up that big amplifier, okay? Let her rip. So, there were some other matters at WRC as well. Probably for me, you know, we have space weather sensors, all of this stuff. This radar sounders at 40 to 50 megahertz is something that is a concern because it has impact on 6 meters. So going forward, we're keeping a good watch on that. For the upcoming WRC, these are some of the items that are on the agenda. You know, there's still some 23 centimeter stuff, space weather, lunar, a lot of things that impact the VHF and above spectrum. For WRC 31, in 8 years, the latest buzzword is WPT, wireless power transmission. And that's so you can drive your electric car over a charging unit and charge it up wirelessly. Well, that wasn't exactly my words. Mine were a little stronger than that, Bob, but that's probably had more to do with the other direction than Jesus. But, well, you know, this is stuff still in development, but it has an impact on the radio spectrum. And it's you know, it's the in thing right now, all of this electric cars and stuff and charging them. So, you know, I don't know how this is going to be developed. It's like 8 years down the road. So, anyway, threats, this is my last slide. So, yeah, we're really lucky, all right, with our spectrum allocation above 144 megahertz, above 2 meters. We have 9% of the allocated spectrum there, either on a primary or a secondary basis. That's pretty good. But that makes us a target for other services because you know right now that there are commercial services that want that spectrum badly. And again, here's this concept of spectrum sharing for primary allocations. And, you know, you start looking at things and, you know, what can we swap, maybe a primary allocation for something, and it's a chess game. So I hope this has been informative to you. I hope you can understand a little better how radio spectrum is allocated. And also, you know, I could talk the rest of the day about this and some of the things that go on behind the scenes. But bottom line is, we came out of WRC 23 with a potential to have a serious impact on the 23 centimeter band. That didn't happen. There may be some future restrictions to come forward. I don't have a crystal ball and can tell you whether any will come about in the United States or not. But for now, carry on. That's all I have, Tony.